Welcome to another of the videos in our Sewing and Making series here at the Harriet Beecher Stowe Center in Hartford, Connecticut. My name is Amy Huffnagel, and I am the Director of Programs and Visitor Experience. And I'm so excited to be joined today by Dr. Mariah Kupfner, who is joining us to be our scholar in residence, helping us answer some questions that we had at the Stowe Center around some ideas about words, right? We wanted to look into this idea that Harriet Beecher Stowe's words were really part of our collection, and then using words for social good and social change, and what's the history of that in the United States. And Mariah took up looking at some possible answers to that question we were posing to ourselves. So thanks for being with us here today, Dr. Kupfner, the Assistant Professor of American Studies and Public Heritage at Penn State Harrisburg, and really interested in the work that you do, with particular your academic work looking at the ways in which needleworkers made women's cultural and political activism and the vision of that visible to all of us now from their historical experience. So it's a text that has been saved and is important in the archive to look at. So thanks so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Amy. I'm delighted to be here. And I will start sharing my screen and get us started here. So I'm here today to talk about stitching sentiments. And I'm going to think here about words and image and how these work together to create an expression of emotion and an expression of commitment for needleworkers. So many of us, I think, understand the power of the stitch. It can be meditative, it can be soothing, it can focus, it can be infuriating, it can be an expression of love, of duty, sometimes simply just a way of keeping our hands moving, or a way of getting to a final desired project and product. The stitch is many things, but to me, a stitch is about paying attention. I often think about this in terms of the stitcher, her own internal experience, but stitches have also been used to get others to pay attention, to look, to listen. So we're here today to think about what it means to stitch sentiments, expressions of care and commitment, perhaps political orientations and statements. And this kind of stitch work has gotten some attention in recent years, framed as craftivism or craft activism. Betsy Greer, who coined this term around the beginning of the Iraq War, has said, quote, "The creation of things by hand leads to a better understanding of democracy because it reminds us that we have power." Picking up a needle, puncturing cloth, making a stitch, there are tangible results from these small actions. And craftivists argue that this helps us see that we have power, that big systems are composed of small things. Single stitches build huge compositions. But there's also a kind of play here, right? A sort of anticipated friction between the craft and the activism. There's meant to be some sort of surprise that textiles are the source of political action. This is where you get the slightly annoying, not your grandmother's refrain. Needleworkers today are insisting upon the capacity of stitched work to express not just politics, but even rage. But what I'm here to talk about today is that this is actually a much longer tradition, that maybe this is our grandmother's needlework. This longer tradition that we stitch ourselves into when we participate in this kind of work is deep. Contrary to the not your grandmother's formulation, women have long been using needle and thread to express their own political commitments, to sharpen their emotional engagement with a topic, and to insist that others attend to their concerns. People might not automatically associate needlework with politics or with activist organizing, but this is precisely the reason why women return to it as an activist form. The expectation of needlework's soft, feminine, domestic, or even moral qualities has been a useful tool for women seeking to make change. For hundreds of years, people have been able to play on typical assumptions of needlework's quiet, docile qualities, and to use the apparent friction between political content and stitched form. So today I'd like to tell you a bit about the use of needlework in women's anti-slavery activism in the 19th century, inspired by Harriet Beecher Stowe's political commitments and her attention to domestic labors and the power of sentiment. In many ways, needlework enabled women's anti-slavery activism. It was a socially acceptable activity that they might use to insist upon the propriety of their engagement in activism. But importantly, it also transformed the form of that activism. Domestic decorative needlework, fancy needlework done at home and not for pay, was understood as a feminine craft in the early 19th century, one that was actually essential training, or understood as essential training for mostly upper and middle class women in normative femininity, preparing them to be moral, refined women. They stitched iconography, patterns, and essentially moral texts on samplers that were meant to both shape their development and to advertise that development, to show one's training. But it was not just this sort of normative activity, because it created time and space for women to focus and to express themselves within an existing structure. And women who became involved in the anti-slavery movement harnessed this tool in self-conscious ways, asking, what happens when we turn the tools of this acceptable form of self-development towards political awakening and consciousness raising? Needlework asks you to focus, as I've said, to pay attention. So anti-slavery stitchers use the act of stitching itself as an opportunity to meditate upon their moral and political commitments. But this meditation also led them to think about their materials, where their cloth and thread came from, and to remember that the home is not cordoned off from the world of politics. The materials we use, that we surround ourselves with, are political, connect us to resources and labor. Anti-slavery needlework enabled women to move beyond the home in important ways, insisting upon their inclusion in political work. But it also brought anti-slavery activism into the home and reminded Northern activists that their domestic lives were not separate from systems of enslavement. Women in the movement used needlework to inspire, to fundraise, to express their politics, and to reflect, to deepen their sentiments. In her 1836 appeal to the Christian woman of the South, prominent anti-slavery activist Angelina Grimke wrote of the work done by women in Northern anti-slavery societies, centering the story of, in her telling, the pains of the enslaved man, quote, representing his kneeling image constantly before the public eye on bags and needle books, card racks, pen wipers, pin cushions, etc. Even the children of the North are inscribing on their handiwork, may the points of our needles prick the slaveholder's conscience, end quote. So this text was a direct counter to claims of the unwomanliness of women in the anti-slavery movement. Grimke was arguing that the prevalence of stitched anti-slavery sentiments proved the moral propriety of women's anti-slavery work and their fierce sincerity in the face of misogynistic attack. She was not alone. Mariah Weston Chapman, who ran the National Anti-Slavery Society Bazaar in Boston, wrote a poem in a gift book for the first annual fair, which strategically claimed women's anti-slavery activism as needlework, and therefore as moral and acceptably feminine. Women's anti-slavery activism was hotly debated, and some women involved in the movement faced threats and violence. In fact, the anti-slavery movement would split in two in 1840, in part over the question of women's involvement in public and leadership roles. Women, especially white upper and middle class women, were not supposed to take public roles, and certainly not overtly political ones. But Chapman, writing here in 1839, just before this split, wrote that everyone should roundly, quote, denounce them who cast contempt on sewing circles, those spheres appropriate of women by law divine as well as human. By this, she meant anti-slavery sewing circles, the form of activism that was so many women's entry into anti-slavery work. Chapman didn't really believe in a divine mandate about the femininity of stitching, but she strategically asserted it, arguing that women stitching baskets, caps, and collars to try to raise $1,000 so that right might prevail and wrong be ended could never be thought unfeminine. Anti-slavery sewing circles became typical forms of women's abolitionist organizing. They were places where private sentiments might start to be made public. Needlework was not just a savvy way to assert the moral rectitude of women in anti-slavery activism, though. It was a real source of income for anti-slavery societies in the 1830s through 50s. In fact, scholars argue that it was women's textiles and fundraising through their textiles that kept institutionalized anti-slavery organizing afloat during these decades. They were sold at fundraising fairs like the one I mentioned in Boston, and these fairs were full of stitched goods for sale, everything from pincushions and work bags to quilts and garments. These were fundraising operations, but they were also social sites, places where women gathered, constructed abolitionist identities, and purchased objects that reminded them and expressed their commitments. Many of the objects sold weren't just fundraisers. They were marked with anti-slavery sentiments, as many of these are. And these created a visual language of women's anti-slavery work. The anti-slavery movement is perhaps best known for this seal, known as the Josiah Wedgwood seal, featuring an enslaved man kneeling in chains and framed by the text, "Am I not a man and a brother?" This emblem was meant to work on the sympathies of the viewer, to ask the implicitly white viewer to consider the shared humanity of an enslaved man. We will talk about the problems with this supplicating posture here and the notion of a white savior. But for now, I want to think about how women used and transformed this emblem. Women and young girls used this and similar iterations printed on needle cases and work bags with text. They stitched it into samplers, pincushions, and more. This is what Angelina Grimke meant when she referred to, quote, his kneeling image, marking needlebooks, pincushions, and work bags. For example, this needlebook bears its message on the inner face of its faded peach-toned silk surface. It's a feminized version of the Josiah Wedgwood seal. Image and attendant text press up against a neat row of needles when closed. There's meant to be an emotional transfer here. The emblem and the text would seep into the needles when this would close, and the sentiments would become activated then with every stitch. Stitchers were instructed to meditate with every stitch, to sharpen their own feelings, but also to infuse those feelings into the work, which abolitionists hoped would convert viewers to the cause, that there would be some spark that was left there in the stitches. So the figures here are encircled with the text, "Am I not a woman and a sister?" and "Remember them that are in bonds as bound with them." And these became somewhat standard images and words in women's anti-slavery activism. And they're important transformations of the original iconography. We might recall Sojourner Truth's most famous speech in which she confronted listeners with a similar refrain. This iconography asks its viewers to reflect on the intersection of race and gender, not to think of enslavement as a monolith. It also positions remembrance, or paying attention, as an essential part of anti-slavery work. These objects ask, again, implicitly white Northern women to consider the subjective experience of enslaved women and to use needlework as an occasion for meditation. Again, there are issues with this. While considering another person's subjectivity is the point here, many stitchers also treated this work as an opportunity to feel their own moral righteousness and objectified depictions of enslaved people. This is a fraught and complicated history, but what I want to highlight here is the fact that people believed that the act of stitching was a key way to activate one's sentimental faculties and then to transmit a moral message outward to, as Angelina Grimke said, prick the conscience. Some women practice this with quilts. A simple cradle quilt sold at the Boston Female Anti-Slavery Society's fair in 1836 may have been stitched by Lydia Mariah Child, a famous anti-slavery activist and prolific author, who described making and selling a quilt that sold for $5 at this very fair. Meant for a child's bed, this small quilt is closely worked with fine hand stitching in a classic evening star motif. Its colors are somewhat muted, an accumulation of printed cotton blocks in star patterns. At first glance, this is a relatively unremarkable quilt. However, the maker clearly played upon the quilt's anticipated home in a cradle, using the implied maternal scene of wrapping a child in a quilt as an occasion to insert political text. Delicately inked in the quilt's central star, you can kind of make it out here, but I'll show a detail. It's a handwritten stanza from Eliza Lee Cabot-Follin's poem, Remember the Slave. It addresses a white audience. Mother, when around your child you clasp your arms in love. And it goes on to ask viewers to think of enslaved mothers. Quote, when her child is torn away, sold for a little slave. Oh, for that poor mother, pray. This is remarkably similar to Stowe's own appeal to the women of the free states, which argued that there was, quote, not a mother among us all who clasps her child to her breast, who could ever be made to feel it is right that that child should be a slave. Sentiment associated with women and the home was understood here to create the fundamental moral argument against enslavement. So the quilt here, a soft object associated with childhood and the maternal embrace, becomes a hard thing because of its text. It asks white Northern women to reflect on the realities of enslavement, even in their own moments of assumed domestic calm. The softness of the quilt is a tool here. It provides a juxtaposition for the political commentary, a point of entry to this political conversation from the home itself. It also prompts a consideration of the quilt's materiality. Is it really so comforting to wrap a child in cotton at this point? Anti-slavery activists like Jonathan Walker used cotton quilts to ask viewers to think about enslaved people whose backs were, in his words, quilted by the driver's lash. So these quilts asked viewers and makers to remember that the domestic space, the mother-child relationship, the quilt itself were political, not separate from systems of enslavement. And indeed, quilts like these helped motivate abolitionist boycotts of cotton and sugar, among other things. Women did not have the vote, but they were considered purchasers in the home. Bringing consciousness about slavery into the white Northern home was an important abolitionist strategy, and textiles were considered key tools here. As a report in an important anti-slavery newspaper, The Liberator, noted in 1858, when pincushions are periodicals and needlebooks are tracts, discussion can hardly be stifled or slavery perpetuated. I found a number of quilts like these, marked with anti-slavery sentiments and text, and sometimes with women's names committing themselves to the cause. Margaret Bracken, a woman in Halifax, England, wrote to Mariah Weston Chapman about the effect of stitching such a quilt in 1857. Bracken stitched a bed quilt to donate to the Boston Anti-Slavery Bazaar, and she wrote, I thought there must be as many stitches in my quilt as you have slaves in America, and I counted the stitches. She does some math and decides there are about 20 times as many slaves in America as there are stitches in my quilt. And when I thought of the helpless misery endured by every individual slave through a lifetime of unprotected bondage, I cannot express the appalling sensation which comes over me. Bracken's stitched process gave her a material sense of the scale of American enslavement. The quilt in her eyes functioned as a tangible reminder of the presence of enslavement made material in the home. For her, the quilt also held within it a vision for a transformed world. She saw its harmonious arrangement of blocks as a model for a differently ordered world. Many abolitionists hope that the harnessing of sentiment might, again in the words of Angelina Grimke, prick the conscience of the slaveholder and convert them. And Bracken wrote that she thought that if slaveholders truly understood what they did, they would, quote, be thankful to be rid of so foul a name, and might say, I would much rather be myself the slave. Her rather naive hope marks much anti-slavery needlework, a faith that pure sentiment would have converting power. But this is also tethered to material practice. Bracken wrote with apologies. She said, "I hope you will excuse this long letter. When an old woman has patched a quilt, she longs to tell someone of the thoughts which occupied her mind during the progress of the work." This occupation of the mind was a core part of the work for abolitionists, though, to spend time thinking, feeling, honing one's sentiments. This was in part why women, as Grimke wrote, were, quote, representing his kneeling image constantly before the public eye, both to sharpen their own sentiments and to convert others. And I'm going to show some images here that I don't want to focus too much on because they're troubling. But the repeated imagery of the kneeling, supplicating enslaved person on anti-slavery needlework is historical fact. And it troublingly seems to link Blackness fundamentally to supplication, imagining a white savior, or perhaps ceding responsibility for transformation in this lifetime. Many samplers assert, "Thou God seest me," locating the possibility for a world without enslavement to some divine rather than human realm. And this is the danger and problem with much sentimental anti-slavery work. It can focus on the interior lives of white people and their cultivation of moral sentiment, not necessarily on the material transformation of the circumstances of enslaved people. And it can, through the imagery, participate in the objectification of enslaved people, a linking of Blackness with enslavement. Again, I don't want to focus on these images, though I think it's important to see this repeated visual language and think about its implications, which we can talk about more in the Q&A. But not all anti-slavery needlework operated this way. The first Women's Anti-Slavery Society was created in Salem, Massachusetts in 1832 by free Black women. And their stitching seems to have focused on making clothes for formerly enslaved people and teaching plain sewing skills to Black women who were seeking employment. Many anti-slavery needlework groups work to raise funds and make materials for direct aid, but it's difficult to find this work unmarked by anti-slavery sentiments, text, and image. It's often not preserved in archives. What I want to close with is a reflection on the power of needlework and the ways in which Black women laid claims to visions of freedom, home, and self-determination in their stitches during this period, in ways that are not always seen or recognized as anti-slavery needlework. There are beautiful works by young, free Black women in this period, often depicting houses. Mary Petts and Frances Bush worked these pieces in the early 1830s in Baltimore, and they're full of sentiments about family and virtue and self-protection. And Anne Plato, the remarkable poet and essayist, worked this piece likely in Hartford in the 1830s. Depictions of houses were understood to communicate a young woman's projection of her own future. They were statements about the shaping not just of a future home, but of a self. Sarah Harris stitched this beautiful sampler in the 1820s in Connecticut, making a statement about her personhood, her family, and her hopes for her future. Sarah Ann Major Harris, born to a family of free Black farmers in Connecticut in 1812, stitched this when she was just a young teenager. It depicts a house and a family register, very typical forms in this period, marking the names and birth and sometimes death dates of the stitcher's family. Sarah began with her parents, marking their marriage date, and she stitched her own name alongside that of 8 of her siblings. This style of needlework, this house sampler, was seen as a sign of training in the norms of refined femininity, and many parents invested considerable funds into training their daughters in these so-called feminine accomplishments. Samplers, as I've said, were seen as receipts of that investment and might be displayed in the home, an advertisement about a young girl's education and refinement. Samplers were places where young girls demonstrated their ability to shape themselves, to construct themselves. They were places to practice one's skills for future work, but also places to display one's ability to learn and to be transformed. Sarah's future was perhaps on her mind as she worked her piece. A few years after stitching this as a 20-year-old, she sought admission to a selective school for young women run by Prudence Crandall, a Quaker woman from Rhode Island. Crandall accepted Harris at the all-white Canterbury female boarding school in Connecticut, but this led to local riots and violence. Parents withdrew their children from the school and even threatened to tear down the building. Crandall closed the school and reopened it as a school for Black women in 1833. This is a long and complicated and important story, but for the sake of time, I want to just focus here on Sarah. Sarah Harris returned to school along with other young Black women. She then married George Fairweather, and the two moved to Rhode Island, where their home became known as a site of abolitionist activism and gathering, and a safe place for formerly enslaved people who had liberated themselves. So the icon of the home here in the sampler, I think, is potent. She went on to purchase a home, in fact, and to leave it in her will to her daughters, all before married women could technically own property in the state. Her home, which had become such an important site of politics, material safety, and familial connection, was hers. And I think back to the meaning of the text on her sampler as well. Her needlework is not marked with explicit anti-slavery language or iconography. It does not ask, "Am I not a woman and a sister?" Instead, it shows her as one member in a family constellation, a daughter, a sister, a young woman embarked on the project of self-making. She did not ask, but simply asserted herself, yes, a woman, yes, a sister, and an agent, not kneeling or supplicating, but working to empower herself and those around her. While craftivism wouldn't have this name yet for many, many years, the notion of taking up soft materials for political ends, of infusing sentiment into one's stitchwork, and using that to not only transform one's internal landscape, but also perhaps to seep out into the outside world, these efforts have deep roots. Today, the mantle is taken up by remarkable stitchers like Dorothy Burge, who painstakingly quilts images of incarcerated people of color, infusing her work with her own prison abolitionist sentiments and insistence upon not looking away. Or Grace Rother, whose abolition quilting bee in 2020 asked participants to stitch a square while meditating upon what would have to change in the world for us to envision a world without police or prisons. I would be delighted to talk in the Q&A about others who are carrying on this tradition of using the needle to pay attention and to envision a transformed world. When we pick up needle and thread, we tap into traditions that ask us to consider the sources of our materials, our implication in systems of exploitation and oppression, and the power of sentiment, and to harness the tools at hand to work to materialize a better world. Thank you.